you so much. And thanks you all for coming this afternoon. Thanks for choosing the oddball session, as it were. I hope I didn't overpromise in the pitch there, and so hopefully this will be interesting. I'm happy to be stopped along the way. I'm happy for questions. Any of that's totally fine. I'm used to it. I'm a college professor. My students don't wait till the end to ask questions. Neither should you. So my title, I'm not sure where this title came from. I certainly didn't write this title, but it works. How to Recognize Linguistic Discrimination. I went ahead and took the liberty of adding a subtitle. So here is the talk in a nutshell. You're welcome to take that in and understand that you've seen the whole thing now. It's everywhere. It's insidious, right? So we'll start here, right? This is one of these things that we see all the time. You go on the internet and you can't help but run into somebody who's complaining about language. Kids today, the language is changing, the language is terrible. And when we see something like this, we tend not to even notice it as something that's potentially really problematic. Instead, a lot of times we think, yeah, that's kind of what we do, right? So I'm going to go way back, and I'm going to come back to some of these things. We're going back to the 1968 Civil Rights Amendment as a starting place. The text of this should look very familiar. This was the Civil Rights Amendment that was the update of the 1964 one, signed a week after Martin Luther King was assassinated. And you'll notice the signing ceremony there. You've got LBJ and a bunch of white guys signing the Civil Rights Amendment, right? But the important thing here for the moment is simply this list of protected categories, right? They sound so familiar to us. We know we don't discriminate based on race, gender, religion, national origin. We can just all rattle those off, right? Okay, I gotta go back here for a second. What I wanna do is play for you a real quick video. This is a 1-minute video. This is an ad put together by HUD a number of years ago. It's a little dated, but it illustrates some really important stuff.
Hello, yes, can I ask a few questions about the apartment on Park Street?
What was your name?
My name is Juan Hernandez.
It's been rented.
Oh, he's gone. Hello, my name is Sanjay Kumar. I am calling about the apartment on Park Street.
It's not available.
Not available? Hello, my name is Tyrone Washington. I'm calling about the apartment on Park Street.
Just been rented.
Hello, I am Chen Ling. My name is Khalid bin Ali. I'm Tuan Vo. Hello, my name is Moshe Goldberg. I use a wheelchair. It's gone. Not available. All right. Thank you. Yes, hello, my name is Graham Wellington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street. Is that still available?
Yes, it is.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
Really?
Housing discrimination is illegal. If you think...
Okay, we know that part, right? Every one of those protected categories is accessible through your voice, right? And that's what's so important about language, is it's not about the language, it's always about the characteristics of the person using that language, okay? I'm gonna play for you another very short vignette. This one is a little bit less kind of scary. This is from a documentary we put together on Voices of North Carolina. I help run the Language and Life Project at NC State. We've done over 4,000 interviews across the state. We've put together all sorts of documentaries. We've won Emmys. This is not an Emmy-winning documentary, so, but I apologize. It's still relatively good at illustrating this point. There's so many things beyond those protected classes that we recognize in somebody's speech. So here's your task. As you watch this, create a mental image of the speaker, all right?
I play a game when I'm working with students. I ask them to lower their eyes for a second and pretend they can't see me. Pretend I'm behind a screen and they're listening to me talk. And as they hear me talk, they can hear that I have a number of Southern features that they associate with upper or middle class in my voice, with the R's, the Ah's, and the G's. They'll hear that it's sort of Southern, but I talk too fast to be Deep South. I don't have that soft spread-on bread from Savannah or some of the areas around in there. You can hear that I'm over 18. I've lost that beautiful breathless quality, that I am, we hope, under 80 because it's not thoroughly cracked. You can hear that I probably like the situation. I have some education. I like the speaker, and if you listen for another minute, you can hear me smile at you. You give away all of that every time you say anything.
Did you get it right?
That's what an accent tells you.
So when I play this for students, a lot of times they even get things like, oh, I've been pictured her with short hair, right? Because there's so many correlates that we have of these categories. I love the fact that she says you can hear her smile at you, because you can tell all sorts of things about a person just listening to them carefully. You can hear all sorts of things about their demeanor, but also those protected classes that we talked about earlier. Okay, I want to go back to the Civil Rights Amendment. One of the things I think you're probably I'm hoping you're seeing at this point, like language is not included there, right? You can still legally discriminate against people based on their dialect or their language in many contexts. Not in all of them, but in many contexts. I want to go back to that HUD video for just a second. That housing discrimination, hearing somebody over the phone and telling them that whatever they want to rent or buy is not available. How many times per year do you think that happens in the United States? That exact type of situation. I need you to commit yourself to a number. If you've got paper in front of you, write it down. If you don't have paper in front of you, really commit to it. What numbers are you thinking or writing down? Yeah.
Nationally?
Yeah.
On a yearly basis?
Yes.
I spent 8 years with Zillow before I came over to Pitney. And so, and we're targeting a rental capacity?
Mostly rental, but it happens with purchase as well. $250,000, okay. $250,000 is our baseline. We can play like Price is Right. Who wants to go above that? Yeah.
I wrote down 3.2 million.
3.2 million.
I got
Half a million. We can go with that. Y'all are in the ballpark. We estimate about 4 million times per year. So this is something that happens all the time, right? And this is clearly then an issue. And it's not just a matter of having systems in place and so forth. Even with the systems in place, even with people getting sued over this thing, we're still having this happen 4 million times a year. So what that tells us is really, when it comes to language discrimination, we just perceive it to be acceptable most of the time. Rosina Lippi-Green's a wonderful academic and public intellectual, and she says that it's so common and is so perceived as appropriate that we must be seen as the last backdoor to discrimination. That door stands wide open. And this is really the impetus for what I do in my professional work. Almost all of my work has to do with dialect discrimination, most of it in the educational context, not in the client experience context, but trust me, we'll get there. Okay, one of the other things I wanted to point out is that lots and lots of companies have done a lot of stuff to foreground DEI initiatives, including things like sexual harassment training, diversity trainings. The vast majority of these, when studied, actually are shown to produce a backfire effect, meaning the vast majority of them result in there being more discrimination after them, not less. But we're doing the same things over and over again. Why do we end up with that? Well, one of the things is we're not thinking about the linguistics of the situation. And a second thing is, once people take these trainings, they think, I no longer sexually harass people. I know that's not something I do. And then they go and they do it. So they actually have license to do the things that they were told not to do as a product of these. So we need really high quality trainings. I'm not convinced that this is one of them, but at least you're here. So thank you. The issue at hand, as Mark Twain in this attributed quotes, he never actually said this, but we like to say that he says all sorts of clever things, right? That there's all sorts of things that that are just not right. Einstein talks about this in a very different way. He says common sense is nothing more than the prejudices laid down by the brain by the age 18. In other words, everything that we think about as common sense is merely some prejudice that you acquired along the way. Language is certainly in that field. Okay. I'm going to shift gears. We're going to talk about dual process theory. Anybody know dual process theory? This is Danny Kahneman over here accepting the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics. More Nobel Prizes in economics have been awarded to behavioral economics since 2002 than any other field. This field has revolutionized business and training in economics in general, but it still remains the sort of thing that not a lot of people know the details of, but it's super important. Okay, his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is there as well. What do you see? 2 lines, thank you. I'm glad that you're the front row student here. Thank you, Caitlin. They are the same, but they look like they're different, right? You look at that, and you think that top line is longer than the bottom one. It just looks longer. But I know it's not. But it does, right? But I know it's not. But so you keep going back and forth. And the second that you focus on one, you can kind of make it out. Okay, yeah, I get it. And then when you look at them together, your brain snaps back and does this like, sorry, they look different again, even though they're the same. So your brain is actively teasing you throughout this. The point of Danny Kahneman's dual cognition or dual process theory is simply that your brain is actually at least two different things. It has system 1 and system 2. I want to draw your attention to just a couple of these differences. System 1 is fast and effortless. It's shared with all sorts of things. If you have a cat or a dog that responds to things, that is system 1. Do you respond to things in the real world? Yes, you're just like your cat and dog in that regard, right? We have this thing that is just, we might think about it as like our instinct or something like that. One of the key ideas here is this idea of implicit knowledge here. If you're familiar with implicit bias training or testing, that's what we mean here. So implicit bias is the bias that lives in our fast thinking system or our unthinking system, essentially. It's not the same as the biases that you might have if you really dislike things. Like, I don't like green peppers, so I have a bias against them. I know that to be the case, and when I eat a green pepper, I have an immediate reaction to it, right? So there's two different things going on here that we have to really separate out.
Is that so when you drive somewhere and you're on autopilot and you
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, there's a really great demonstration. This is when you, this is very much related to your question about driving and being on autopilot. If you were right now to close your eyes, put your hands on the wheel in front of you, and shift lanes really dramatically, like I got to really get over quickly, you'd be like, oh yeah, I move my hand this way, and then I go back to center. But that's not what you do. You actually go that way, you come back through center, and then you recenter it, because that's the only way that your car will not continue going off the road. And so you know that to be the case. New drivers have to figure that out, but then it becomes ingrained. Once it becomes ingrained, then it's part of our system 1 processing. And there's great experiments out there, like where people are like told to drive the regular route home, and then there's a clown on the side of the road like waving at them, and they get home and they get asked, hey, did you notice anything unusual? No. We don't even notice the things along the sides of the roads, right? So yeah, this is the exact same thing. Here's the other visual for it, the kind of cognitive, smart thing that we have going on with system 2, and then we have our system 1. So why do we have system 1? Because thinking is biologically taxing to your body. Your brain runs on sugar. That's why if you're working really hard, you end up with a sweet tooth typically, because it runs on sugar. The metabolic process to feed your brain is really, really taxing. And so system 1 exists to keep your brain from thinking as much as it possibly can. It takes over as many things as it possibly can because it's hard to think and it's metabolically taxing to think. It's kind of depressing, right? So we go back to this same thing here. And at this point, you know exactly what's going on. And you can say, system 2 tells me. When I analyze these things very carefully, I can see them as the same length. But then system 1 takes back over, and you see it that. And so that's why I'm using this as a demonstration here, because you really can never get beyond system 1. You can invoke system 2 for a certain amount of time, but then system 1 kicks back in, okay? Okay. I'm going to run through a couple of experiments that have been done, mostly in behavioral economics. The big insight of behavioral economics is simply this. We have always had economic models that assume people are rational. They are not rational, right? And so this is one of the scenarios where it's clear when we look at the results, people are not rational. So with that in mind, you must be thinking to yourself, well, it's probably scenario 2 that people are saying is the one they would like to repeat. The one that has the exact same amount of pain, but a slightly better finish to the pain, even though it takes 90 or 30 seconds longer, right? So fully 80% of the respondents chose the theoretically more painful experience because the end of the experience colors your memory of the entire thing. Things that end better are perceived as better overall than things that were amazing but ended poorly. That's an important lesson. we have these different biases as well. This is two of them put together here that results in all sorts of things like this. Nobody, I'm telling you, nobody thinks their own problems are because of themselves, right? It's always some other factor, but when that same problem manifests in somebody else, boy, are we quick to point out how they are the problem, they caused that, right? And so we have these self-serving biases and extra observation biases that are really, really problematic here. We also have a blind spot bias, and this is, again, tied it to what I showed earlier about sexual harassment trainings backfiring. We tend to think that we're less biased than everybody else. And, you know, when you look at all sorts of other statistics, we see this stuff showing up in kind of humorous ways. So when asked, 90% of drivers say that they are better than the average driver. If you're not familiar with statistics, then 50% are worse than the average driver, right? And so we know very clearly that people just really overestimate their own abilities all the time, including their ability to not be biased or so forth. Did it work this time? Did you see him differently? Still, right? It still does it. You can't get past it, right? That brain, that lizard brain, that primordial brain is so strong. You just can't get past it. Okay. We have this really cool thing called an anchoring effect. The very first piece of information you're given in a context really, really impacts everything that comes after it. Okay, did Gandhi die when he was 140? You know that to be a ridiculous, ridiculous thing. Right? No, he didn't live to 140. So write down how old he was when he died. This doesn't actually work once you do both parts of this experiment yourself, but this is if you divide people into two groups and then you say to the other group, hey, did Gandhi die when he was 9? And we all have these pictures of Gandhi as an older person, and they're like, no, that's so ridiculous. And then you ask them the same question, okay, well, write down how old he was when he died, right? And what's really interesting is then you get this pretty dramatic difference, 17-year difference in the estimated death based on what you were primed with. Both those primed numbers were so ridiculous, but you got anchored to it. You got anchored to the high number in the first case and the low number in the second place, right? And this is something that happens all the time. I'm sure you have strategies about negotiations, and you've probably heard both sides of the advice, always give the first number, never give the first number, these types of things. That first number is the anchor for the rest of the negotiation, always, right? And there's just one of those things, like it really makes a huge difference, the order. Anybody know how old Gandhi was when he died? That's what's great about this. He was 78. So outside the range of both those, right? It's kind of interesting that, you know, even with our pictures of him as like this old guy, like so anyhow, yes. He lived to be 70. Okay. Related to what we just saw with the anchoring effect is priming. This is a linguistic concept. So how do you get down from a duck? You have a down pillow? the feathers from a duck, you know, down. So you pluck them, right? You've ruined my joke that I'm coming to here. So thank you, Denise. No, it's okay. It's just as good this way. So how do you get down from an elephant? And the answer is obviously, well, you step down, right? Or you get a ladder or something like that. What's really interesting is not this joke. It's actually not a good joke. I'm a linguist, not a comedian. And the point here is simply that if you had your brain hooked up to a computer that was measuring the cognition, the second this second sentence came out, your brain would spike. It doesn't know what to do with that because that word that it knows was just used in this one context is being used in a different context, but it expects that same context to be related, right? And so the point here is simply this. Everything that is said is impacted by the things that are said previous to it, okay? So we're starting to put together some linguistics and some behavioral science here. Here's another example of them. Picture in your head what's going on. Picture in your head what's going on here. And then lastly, picture what's going on in your head here, right? 3 different drives. And again, our brain is smart enough that when we evoke system 2, we're able to figure out the difference between these 3 sentences. But that brain activity that we measure, it's just so clearly measurable, and we can do it in lots of different ways. Your reaction time slows, your skin actually starts to sweat, your eyeballs dilate, and your brain has this spike of activity as you go from one sentence to the next. You don't know your body's doing all those things, but it is, because there's something linguistically confusing, and it's having to switch from system 1 to system 2, and the second you have to make that switch, your body starts using energy, and all those other things happen because of that. Okay, priming and comprehension. This is a really amazing study. This is a study where if you were primed with the belief that your teacher or physician or boss was an English as a second language speaker, and then you watched a presentation by that speaker, you would perform worse on a comprehension test about what was presented than if you were not told that whatsoever. In other words, because you don't expect to understand, you actually don't understand. That's the sort of finding that every single one of us would want to say, that would not apply to me. But it does. It applies to all of us. Our expectations going into a situation dramatically impact not just our experience in that, but the things that we remember from that. And that's powerful, right? We see this all the time in other types of experiments. I want to explain one other experiment that's really, I think, demonstrative of this principle. And that is this really smart study of Asian women at an elite school that were told they were going to have to take a math test. And if you know this one, right? So if you were told going into the math test that, hey, women tend to do poorly on this test, their scores went down. But if you told them that Asians tended to do well on this math test, their scores went up. Same people, same test. Primed by different ideas about themselves, they perform better or they perform worse. And that's so valuable because when we start to think about the ways that we are priming people all the time, when we're having conversations with them, what can you do to prime them for something that they think is beneficial about themselves, some quality that's really great about themselves, right? I'm not going to give you specific examples here, but you can imagine this is the type of thing that really can set the mood, especially as it becomes an anchoring piece of that conversation, if you evoke something that that person is about them that's good, or something about them that they value. And this is the basis for, if you're familiar, many of you come up through marketing and so forth, the elaboration likelihood model, which is probably the single most taught model. This is the whole basis for it. And now we understand why it works, even though that theory's been around since the 80s. Okay, so let's put these two together really, really explicitly here. Language is situated in system 1. Once you have acquired the language, and notice I didn't say learn. Learn is a very different process than acquisition. None of you learned your first language outside of like speech pathologies and things like that, right? We all simply acquired it. Nobody had to simply like give you all the sounds like this is a buh sound and this is, you do this and you acquire it and you experiment and you make mistakes and they're predictable and they're beautiful and wonderful and you say like, I saw 3 deers in the yard because we always add an S on the end of things. And over time, nobody has to say, oh, I know you're only 2, but that's not how we say that, right? You just simply acquire the patterns of the dialects that are around you. And because of that, you tend to not have a lot of metalinguistic knowledge or knowledge about your language. In fact, what you know about English, if English is your first language, you probably know most by studying a foreign language. And so there's something that's a little bit ironic about that, right? This thing that we use all the time and that's so important and that many people have said is essential to discriminating humans from other types of animals, this thing that we really conduct all of our businesses in, we don't understand hardly at all, right? Unless you're a linguist. And even then, I don't know that most of us understand language all that well. And so a couple other things here. This is really remarkable. I haven't planned out a single sentence in this talk, but I've been relatively fluent. And so we start sentences all the time without thinking about how they're going to end. When we're listening, you're not actually listening. You're doing exactly what your iPhone is doing. You're trying to predict the next word. Sometimes you're good at it, sometimes you're bad, just like your phone, right? And so we're not actually listening ever passively. We're always actively predicting the rest of the utterance. You thought I was going to say sentence, didn't you? Okay, maybe not. Okay. Oh, wrong way. Yeah.
That just blew my mind there. Because the moment you said that, and I sort of read ahead, I then tried to figure out, was I really doing that? And my brain could not either let me see what it was doing or not do it. I don't know. The whole thing about we're constantly trying to figure out what the rest of the sentence, the rest of what somebody's about to say in the sentence.
Yeah. Do you not?
That one, I've gone along with everything there. But that
Yeah.
one, I just can't wrap my head around.
Yeah, so the question really is about why are we doing this work, right? It's a lot of work to constantly be thinking about there's all these possibilities for the end of this sentence, and this is the one I think is most likely. So why is the brain doing that? Is that fair for your question?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The real answer is that's what the brain does for everything. Your brain is, I'm going to say it's more, but it's not much more than a prediction machine. It's looking for patterns. It's always looking for patterns. This happened, I expect that. If that pattern holds, totally unremarkable. You might not even recognize it, might not see every time this happens that. Your brain's not like lauding itself there. It's when there's an expectation that's not met, it's like, oh, that's new data. That's interesting, right? And so it's those moments, and as kind of a silly example here. How many of you had this experience? And I hope you all raise your hands. You've been thinking about calling somebody or texting somebody, and then out of the blue, they just do it, like immediately afterwards, right? And it's like that. If we estimate that, we always say like that happens all the time, right? But it doesn't. You're just not remembering the times that it didn't happen, right? And so we're really bad at that. It's with times where we have these anomalies where it's like, whoa, that was weird. And when you have a couple of those anomalies, you're like, oh, a pattern. That's interesting. And your brain recognizes it and registers it. And so what it's doing with language is the same thing it does with the sun rising and setting in the day. At noon, you're probably thinking, yeah, the sun's going to start to set, right? You're not, I hope your internal monologues are more interesting than that. But your brain is predicting everything around you all the time, including language. So it's really amazing. It's really amazing. Okay. Here's the key. Every implicit bias that you have gets encoded into your interactions with other people. And we don't want them to, right? So we know, based on those protected classes, not to have explicit biases about these types of things. But we have to all recognize we do have implicit biases about all of these things. Every single one of them gets encoded into every single conversation you have. Because your brain is not engaged in system 2 as you're having those conversations. You couldn't have a conversation with your brain engaged that deeply for an extended period of time. You just can't do it.
So can we remove biases with system 2 that will cleanse system 1?
That's the most. The question here is, can we train our system 2 to get rid of our system 1 biases? The answer is no, and this is our proof right here. You still can't make your brain see these as different.
But when you flash that up there,
Yes.
because I've seen it before, isn't it amazing how they look like they're the different length, but they're the same length?
Yep.
I know it.
Yep.
I know it.
Yep. Absolutely. We know it, and we can talk our way out of it. But the absolute application of your brain in that moment was to register them as different lengths, even though they're the same. And that's the exact thing that's going to happen when you have a conversation with somebody. And I'm going to show you some examples of that in just a second here. And I think there's something unsettling about this until we simply accept the fact that every human is biased and prejudiced, like we all are. right? Like there's just no way around it. It's a simple psychological fact that we see that we see things like race and gender, and we categorize our societies based on these types of things. And anytime there's something that's important for categorizing society, your brain has ideas about it. That is what your brain evolved to do, right? It makes perfect sense. You have to understand threat from not threat. You have to understand food from non-food, right? You're constantly looking for data, testing these hypotheses, looking for patterns, and so every bit of what your brain is designed to do relies on it stereotyping. This thing is probably edible because it's like that thing. That is a stereotype that's exactly akin to the types of stereotypes that we carry about other people, right? Not that we eat other people, but that we categorize other people, right? And so this is just what our brain is doing. So going back to language, this is one of those things where I think we use language so much that we're just not aware of it. You're not aware of the air around us or the gravity, as this quote suggests. We just take those things for granted and don't really focus on them, right? We don't understand them. We don't ever study them. I mean, you might study grammar or gravity if you're a physicist or something like that, but most of the time we're not really studying these types of phenomena very closely. We might have a cursory understanding of them. Language is the same way. All right, this is an entire semester's worth of content on one slide. Because you're not my undergraduate students and I don't have you for 16 weeks, I'm just going to go through these really fast. Every language variety, by language variety we mean things like language and dialect. You might know that there's a difference between those two things. Linguistically, there's no difference between those two things. Languages and dialects cannot be defined as separate from each other. And so I can tell you more later if you want, but not right now. Every single language variety is patterned. This makes perfect sense if you think about it. Nobody could communicate with anybody else if we didn't agree upon patterns. That's what the brain does, right? That's what we've been saying this whole time. Every language variety has basically the same grammatical capacity as every other language variety. There's no such thing as a broken language. There's no such thing as an incomplete language. There's no such thing as a language that can't talk about the past or things like that, despite what sometimes popular articles suggest. Every single person speaks a dialect. We oftentimes use that term for things that are socially stigmatized and say those people speak dialects. In fact, linguistically, everybody speaks a dialect. This is the most basic fact of the field. Again, I can explain more of this later. Every time we evaluate a dialect, we're actually evaluating people. I don't know if you've heard about Ebonics or African American English. A lot of people say, oh, I don't like that. That sounds terrible. It's a bastardization of English. All those are actually judgments about people, or at least the very least, they reflect our implicit biases about those groups. Same would be true of kids today if we complain about the way that kids use language. Dialects are not because people were imperfect in their learning. Everybody acquires language. Everybody with normal, non-pathological brains acquires language in roughly the same way. And then the last thing is, a lot of people think that we all watch the same TV and so our languages are all converging to one. They're not. They're becoming more dissimilar from each other. Northern and Southern English are more dissimilar now than they have ever been. African American English and what we think about as white English is more different now than ever. And if you are familiar with the history of the world at all, that shouldn't be surprising. That's what's always happened. Latin gave us French, Portuguese, Spanish, etc., right? Each of those has lots of different varieties associated with them. Language differentiation always happens. Language convergence is very rare. And even with technology and education, we've slowed down change, but this change is still taking our dialects further apart from each other. I think this becomes more important even as we look to the future, as our dialects of American English are separating pretty dramatically. Yes, sir?
Not me trying to
Yeah.
these things, but I remember growing in the South and moved to Denver, and when I was about 20, and just by myself, and at first they were making fun of my Southern accent.
Yeah.
And I didn't take it as a negative. I was just over. And And then about 5 years later, the first time I came back to North Carolina to live, people were like, you talking? And then I go back to Denver a few weeks later, and I had to move some more stuff out. And they say, you picked up your Southern accent again.
Yep.
And I was just like, because I didn't realize any difference, or I was trying to.
Yeah.
So there's some kind of acclimation that happened there.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And the thing about language, in this example of moving around the country and picking up, losing your Southern accent, then picking it back up, and then all it does is it's telling us that's all system one. None of that was happening with system two. You weren't like, I'm back in the South, this is how I use language now, and I'm monitoring my speech. It just happens. System one. It's exactly what's going on right there. So you have a linguistic competence that's broad, and you're able to shift. We might call you a linguistic chameleon, even, being able to shift your dialect from place to place. And some people are really good at it, and some people are really bad at it. That's the reality. And so, yeah, it makes perfect sense. This is what we do. We're impacted by the speech of the people around us.
I just want to add to that. So I'm from Iowa. I've always lived in Iowa. I have a twin sister. And we both noticed that when we travel, it's kind of embarrassing that we automatically sort of pick up on that and start mimicking. I don't want to say mimicking because that sounds negative. You know what I mean? But it's embarrassing. I feel like I'm making fun of it, and I'm not. I like to think it's some form of
Yeah. Yeah, so linguistic chameleons, this is an actual term, I didn't just coin it. Linguistic chameleons are people who, are really kind of just naturally accommodate to the people around them. And oftentimes it's not a problem, but often in other cases it really does become problematic in that community. And it just has to do with cultural norms of that community, right? So for instance, if I tried to accommodate to the speech of the African Americans that I've interviewed for our latest documentary, Talking Black in America, then they would not welcome me into that community very well. In fact, I would probably, those interviews would be very different than the ones that we have, where I don't even try to accommodate to that, because that's not my speech variety, right? So there's times we can do it and times we can't. Societies that are really sensitive to this type of thing, and other societies that love it when you try to accommodate to them. And it's all culturally based, and that takes me perfectly to this idea of just like language is really all about culture. So this is a book that I've written on North Carolina's dialects, and in this book we argue that it's such an important piece. It's probably like the most important piece of culture because it actually touches so many other aspects of it. And so I love this quote, that it's more than about who we have been in the past, it's about who we wish to be. Our language is aspirational, always.
Is that book about North Carolina dialect?
It is, yeah. And it has about 130 QR codes in it, so you can actually hear the dialects, because you can't even just write about this type of thing. It was the first linguistics book to do that. All right, we're back to where we started here, right? Now we know that when we're judging people based on spelling, grammar, punctuation, and sentence structure, we're really judging them based on those categories that we know we're not supposed to do that on. Now, I have to admit, this is a little bit of a move I've pulled on you, because some of these, like spelling, are purely related to writing. And writing's different than speech. I just want to be really upfront there, right? That if somebody's a bad speller, there might be a million reasons for it, but it's not typically tied to their dialect, right? It might be tied to how much they've read, the type of education they got, all sorts of things. And so, yeah, that one there might be a little bit like you could probably judge somebody as like, oh, you're not a reader if you're that bad of a speller, right? Those types of things we're still making assumptions on, but the other things like pronunciation, sentence structure, grammar, all those things really are about culture.
So,
Yeah, please.
So as it pertains to, system 1 and system 2 in writing, how can we completely override system 1 in writing?
Yeah, so the question here is, can we override system 1? And the answer is most people engage heavily system 2 when they're writing. And so Writing is, we make this distinction in linguistics. It's not the best terminology, but we say that, that oral language is natural and writing is artificial. And what we mean is that there's something that's naturally acquired versus something that has to be learned. So writing has to be learned. You didn't acquire writing on your, by just observing. You were taught how to write, right? That's an important distinction. And eventually, some aspects of writing get shuffled over to System 1 a little bit. So you're not probably really thinking hard when you're making a distinction between it's with an apostrophe and it's without an apostrophe. There was a time in your life where you were thinking really hard, right? But now those two things exist as separate lexemes in your head, such that our experiments with priming earlier, where I'm using the same word multiple times, it only works because you're not producing it yourself. If you were producing it yourself, there wouldn't be cognitive load there, because these different meanings really do get encoded as separate entries. We think about the dictionary and we say oh, there's 6 definitions here. Your brain just puts the six entries together instead of having them, oh, that's one word, it means these different things. Which ones are? So yeah, I mean, System 2 really does govern the larger writing issues. Those kind of smaller things eventually get, kind of more automated. And this is why writing becomes less taxing over time, right? If you can just imagine yourself as a child and how hard it was to write those essays. You remember when you had to write 3 sentences, and then it goes up to 5, and then it's a whole paragraph, and then it's a paper, right? Those are big jumps, because writing at that stage was hard. And now the distinction between a 10-page well, you're not my students, a 10-page paper and a 15-page paper, it doesn't matter, right? I can do either of those, it's the same thing, right? So that's definitely a suggestion that those things have become more automatic. You understand the forms. You know this is the genre that I'm working with. This is the template. I'm filling in things into that template. All that becomes pretty automatic. You know where to put your thesis sentence, how to do those types of things. Does that make sense? System 1 tries to keep System 2 from operating every chance it gets. Okay. Yes. Yep. Biologically, it just is better for our bodies to not use up that sugar. Sugar is rare. This is something we hear in education all the time. I actually run an education program for secondary English teachers, so I get to do all the student teaching observations and things like that, and I hear this all the time. And so we've trained our students to say things like dialects are differences, not deficits, because the deficit view is the one that lots of people have. That's a bad dialect. That dialect's going to be a problem for them, those types of things. And so, oops, wrong button. So I wanted to point out that we've been looking, people have been looking for the effects of dialects as causing difficulties with reading for 50 years. Nobody's ever found any. It's never the dialect. It's always the teacher as the mediator between the student and the text. That's the problem here. So this conversation really should go something like this. As we're thinking about it, it's actually the teacher that's the problem, not the student in these cases. And we simply don't have enough education about the impact of linguistics for people to kind of understand that. You didn't take it as part of your K-12 education. You might have taken a linguistics class in college, and if so, it was probably intro to linguistics. And that's so different from what we're talking about with sociolinguistics, which is what all of this has been today. And so it's just not something that's part of the academic mainstream. People don't know about this stuff, even though we all have stories about language. And thank you all again for sharing your stories about language today. I want to go way back in time, 100 years here. This quotation is so ridiculous, isn't it? The use of foreign language in the home is one of the chief factors in producing mental retardation. Do y'all know who Florence Goodenough was? That's who said this. She is the person who has been the most influential person in the modern standardized testing movement. Her models are the ones that all the subsequent standardized testing and IQ tests are based on. And this is her conclusion. What's that? Still to this day. Now, the Stanford Binet test really made a radical shift the last time they redid it. such that there's now non-linguistic components to every one of the intelligences that they purport to observe. But this is her study, right? It's a bad test. A bad test gives you bad data. That's not surprising, right? What's surprising is that this was the ideology at the time. Everybody assumed, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense, right? We know that that's silly to this day, but we have all sorts of other ideologies about language, many of which stem from standardized testing. You're familiar with the achievement gap, I'm sure, right? We're gonna look at that here. So when we look at dialect and standardized testing, we see to this day that our test norming tends to be done on overwhelmingly white samples used to describe multicultural populations. If you're not sure what that means, it means we take a small group of white kids and we say, how'd you do on this test? And then we assume everybody in the population should pattern exactly like those white kids. There's all sorts of cool stuff out there. The on-par testing system put together by the Center for Applied Linguistics, where I used to work, in the University of Wisconsin, is a non-linguistic test of math and science. When it was deployed, it eliminated the achievement gap for math and science, not just among dialect speakers, but among ESL speakers. In other words, you get the same patterning. People understand math and science on a continuum. And we can replicate that when we remove language from the situation. Language can be very subtle. This really cool study over at UNC Chapel Hill put brain probes on kids as they were taking math tests. Whenever they got to a question that had a feature, a linguistic feature that was different from their native dialect, including this third-person singular S in a question like, a train leaves the station traveling blah, 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 right? That S is different from what they have in their native dialect. I can tell you the history of why that S is so ridiculous in standard English, but I'm not going to yet. You can ask about it later. But that little difference causes there to be a huge increase in mental cognition at that moment, because they have to evoke system 2 to figure out what the heck is going on. That's not what I expected. Over the course of the test, it was found that these students' mental load was substantially higher than the white children who were also taking this test. We get these really strange anomalies, like on the SAT, elite African-American students outperform white students on the questions that require the most learning and the least acquisition. And so we know there's problems with our tests, but we continue to use them. Let's talk about language and policing. This really great study out of Stanford, it's amazing simply because of the access that these researchers were granted. 981 police stops were body cam recorded, and every single one of them for a month among the Oakland Police Department. That is incredible access. This study found, as you can see here, that there was huge differences in the cumulative impact of policing on the interactions with the black community versus the white community. And the researchers here are saying things, to be clear, these are well-behaved officers. These are not kind of these anomaly types of stops. These are just routine things, right? So these little things add up to pervasive racial disparities, right? And so when you look at the statistics, things like, did they say thank you? Police officers said thank you to the people they stopped if they were white, 50% of the time, 57% of the time more. And so things like, can I see your license? Thank you, right? That little thank you is something important, right? The opposite side, you can see 61% more likely to hear something that was quite negative. And so these are really minor, right? And so we kind of think like, what's the big deal? But the point here is simply, these are system 1 biases that are coming out, right? I'm supposed to be polite to white people. I don't have to be polite to African Americans. I can be demeaning to African Americans. I can try to assert power over African Americans. All these types of things are simply the implicit biases of these police officers coming out in these cases, right? And again, I want to go back to that second point there. These were well-behaved police officers. Do y'all remember this trial, the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman trial? If you don't, this is Rachel Gentel here, who was the most important witness for the defense. She is Haitian. So her first language is Haitian Creole. She does speak English, but with a very strong accent. And so when we look at what people said about Rachel Jeantel in public, you see all these incredibly negative things, right? These are people, in many cases, educated people who feel licensed to say really horrible things about somebody's language variety because we all have this idea that African American English is a terrible thing, right? Not all of us, of course, right? But lots of society members in general, right? So when we start to look at this, we see kind of like overwhelmingly the evaluation of her was incredibly negative, and that evaluation was almost purely based on her linguistic components. Her linguistics are simply her culture. In an interview, one of the jurors said that basically they found her not credible because they couldn't understand her. And in the deliberations, her testimony wasn't referenced a single time. The most important witness for the defense played no bearing on the actual decision of this case, according to the jurors. That stinks. I mean, at the very least, that just stinks, right? And why is it that we are so quick to dismiss it? Because we have these linguistic biases, and we don't think that it's a problem to enact them. I want to take a quick look at court translators, and so in this case, Rachel Jeantel should have been eligible for a court translator because Haitian Creole is not English, but she was denied one by the judge because he thought it was English enough. Let's talk about court reporters for just a second here. Court reporters are required to achieve an accuracy level of 95% in their court transcripts. And what's really interesting about court reporters is their report becomes the official document of the court, so that when you're in jury deliberations, you're not told to think about what you remember, you're told to look at what the court reporter said happened. So you might say, oh, I thought I heard that differently. Doesn't matter. That is the official record, okay? This study out of the University of Pennsylvania for African-American testimony, 60% accuracy. Word error rate, 17%. Even paraphrasing, wrong a third of the time. They're understanding what was being said and being able to say, oh yeah, I think he said something like this. Was wrong a third of the time. That's remarkable. That suggests those are really different dialects. And maybe we have to have court reporters that get certified in African American English if they're allowed to transcribe the speech of African American English. We're actually working on that in North Carolina right now.
So is there a way that AI or some version of sophisticated computer verbal reading?
It's a great question about AI and transcription, automatic transcription. It's actually, at the moment, it's even worse. And so it is something that's promising. It's become much better, but it's still not there yet. Okay, we're getting a little short on time. I'm gonna go really quickly through a couple things here. We're almost at the end. There's this really amazing murder case that Dr. John Baugh at the University of St. Louis writes about, or University of Washington at St. Louis, where basically a telephone call from jail was recorded. It was misunderstood. This little distinction between I know I ain't committed this shit and I know I committed this shit is just, it's different. And so when you look at the actual recording, you can see on a spectrogram, because we can actually map onto a computer what the speech energies are like as they come out of your mouth, we're able to see this is nasalized. So we can actually prove that this smoking gun here is actually not a smoking gun at all, but simply a misrepresentation. We're lucky in this case we had John Baugh. This person did get off eventually. This was, even though this was a huge problem here. Okay, so B-A-U-G-H, John Baugh. Basically, when we look at this, we see humans are problems, But when we look at computers, they tend to be even worse. And so every single thing in this ridiculous slide here has been found to impact your sentencing. So if you've done something wrong, try to get your trial moved to your birthday. You will have more leniency. It makes no sense, but that's the way that these types of things work, right? And so I just want to suggest that the human component really is important here, and we would try to farm that out. We oftentimes encode into our algorithms our human biases, right? Okay, here's some user reactions to microaggressions. These are my users, students. They stop participating in courses. They feel uncomfortable. Satisfaction with the university goes down. Eventually, they transfer away. We actually lose students because they don't find my university, NC State, to be linguistically welcoming to them. That's a problem, right? So what can be done here? Thank you for coming today. We're going way back in time now. I think this is the earliest one. Ferdinand de Saussure, the father of linguistics, says linguistics should be something that everybody studies. And I agree with that. And so this is a first step there. Being aware, like language is really crazy and cool, and it's amazing how it works, right? So we created the Language Diversity Ambassadors at NC State. We go around and do all sorts of community and campus events. You can see some of those. We've put together, I'm not going to show you, videos and featuring our chancellor and all sorts of things about NC State as a welcoming community. We're at every student orientation. We're at every faculty and staff orientation. Linguistic diversity becomes a part of your onboarding no matter how you get into the university. Does it make a difference? I don't know. I don't think it changes System 1, but at least it plants that seed where teachers or students have this interaction and they think, oh, that's that thing I heard about one time before. Maybe I should think more critically about it. I wanted to give you a couple quick takeaways here in the last seconds. We have this definition of good English that generally is pervasive in the business world. You try not to be distracting. Try to fly under the radar. I think we can do better than that. I think we can really be accommodating with different language varieties there. It's a part of everybody's primary discourse. This is a language philosopher, James Paul G's idea. We have these, I never get it right, saying, writing, doing, being, valuing, believing stances in the world, right? These kind of this whole thing. Like language is just about how we interact in the world, every bit of it. It affects every single one of those things. And when we value more of these things, we really are valuing more people and cultures. So here's some practical hints. Hire a linguist, or at least maybe a grad student as an intern or something like that. We have lots to contribute. We have to actually resist homophily. This is the idea that over time organizations become less diverse, more similar. The individual pieces of an organization start to sound and look and feel more like each other. And so we actually have to resist that actively. We have to allow minorities, minoritized voices to anchor discussions. Remember that term from earlier? Let them speak first. One of the things that Danny Kahneman talks about is this idea of when people commit themselves to a number, which you did earlier, that you're not influenced by the other numbers that are said. So coming to meetings with this stuff already established for each individual person gives you better estimates, better data, and better and those types of things. Okay. The last piece here, ensuring language reflects your core values. I'm going to suggest that we all have this core value that's something like this. We want to accept more people. We want to accept all sorts of people. I'm going to tell you the single fastest growing linguistic feature right now that's related to that. And you can decide what you want to do with it. Y'all. Y'all is transforming in American culture right now. In the demographic from 15 to 35, this is seen as an important signal of acceptance and inclusion. Using y'all is incredibly powerful. And people have avoided it for a long time because it was Southern, and we tried to avoid Southern things. But y'all is showing up in Portland, in Seattle, in California, it's everywhere. Y'all is the single most kind of iconic marker of being accepting and inclusive among a really large demographic. What do you do with that? That's for you to decide, not for me. I get to study what happens with it. In fact, I have a student writing a book on that right now. But I just want to end with this here. This is a demonstration that we use with all of our language diversity ambassadors. What bird is flying correctly here? I mean, it's such a stupid question. But when you ask somebody, what's the right way of speaking? People have really strong answers, but it should be this. Both, right? Thank you all.